couple years ago, I had the great opportunity, privilege to visit our neighbors to the north, Egypt. I went and spent about 8 days. I went to Cairo, to the place where the great pyramids are built, and I went down to Luxor and saw a temple that Ramses had built, and sailed or did a cruise down the Nile, down to Aswan, even got to visit Abu Simbel. And while I was there, I learned a few things about ancient Egyptian mythology and theology. One of my favorite ancient Egyptian mythological tales is the story of Osiris and Isis. The Egyptians believed that in hoary antiquity, the gods used to rule the world. They were the kings. And they believed particularly that the god Osiris was a great king, and he had a wife named Isis, and she had a sister named Nephthys, and he had a brother named Seth, my namesake, which is unfortunate because Seth turns out to not be a very nice guy. The story goes that Osiris was a great king, and Seth was therefore very jealous. And so Seth killed Osiris, took his body, chopped it up into pieces, and then scattered it all around Egypt, all up and down Lower and Upper Egypt. Isis and Nephthys wept. They mourned the death of Osiris. And Isis decided that what she would do is she would go all over Egypt, and she would hunt and try to find all the places where Seth had buried the parts of the body of Osiris. And she did that, and she gathered them all up, and she put the body of Osiris back together again in what became the original mummy. That was the original mummy, Isis putting Osiris back together again. And then she was a powerful goddess, according to the story, and she did a magical spell, and lo and behold, the body of Osiris came back to life from the dead, and then became the god, the ruler of the underworld, the afterlife. The god that everybody has to face when they die, who will decide, okay, you're going to make it into the afterlife or not. Egyptians who had money decided that they would try to mimic what Isis had done to Osiris. That's how they started doing mummification. They would have a 70-day embalming and mummification process. And if you were a king, a pharaoh, a courtier of the king, somebody with a lot of money who could afford it, then when you died, your body would go through that long process of being turned into a mummy. And they would remove all of your internal organs. They would take the brain, and it's kind of gross, but they would go through the nose and remove the brain. They would cut into the abdominal area and remove all of the internal organs and put them in canopic jars. Everything would be removed except for the heart. The heart stayed inside of the mummy. And they would take the heart and they would cover it with an amulet that looked like a scarab beetle. It was the heart scarab. And over the heart, it would rest and tell the heart not to betray the person in the day of judgment. The Egyptians believed that in life, you have your body and you also have your ba. Your ba is similar to what we as Christians believe is your spirit. It's not exactly the same. It's more complicated than that. But they believed in the body and they believed in the ba. And they believed your ba gets activated at night when you dream. So most of the time your ba is not very active. But when you're dreaming, your ba enters into the spirit world, into the world of the gods, and can actually be communicated with by the gods. And they believed that after you die, your ba leaves the body and has to go through a series of tests to see if it will be able to enter into the afterlife. The ba has to go into the hall of double judgment, double justice, and appear before Osiris and 42 gods who will question the Ba. And the Ba has to stand there and say, I never did 42 different things. I never polluted the Nile. I never eavesdropped and listened to my neighbors while they were quarreling. I never robbed my neighbor. I never committed adultery. I never blasphemed the gods. I never sinned. Now, of course, which one of us would really be able to say that we had never done all of those things? That's why the heart scarab was over the heart. It acted like a magic spell so that you could kind of trick the gods and they wouldn't know that you hadn't done those things or that you had really done those things. And then your heart would be weighed in the scales of justice there before Osiris. And on the one hand of the scale would be an ostrich feather representing justice. And on the other hand is your heart. And if your heart is heavier than the feather, then it's taken and it's thrown to a crocodile-headed monster named Amit and devoured, and you have no chance at the afterlife. But if your heart is lighter than a feather, your heart has no sin in it, your heart really is just, well then your Ba will be allowed by Osiris to enter into the afterlife by going back to your body, being reunited with the mummy, and you are given a second chance in a resurrection from the dead. We've been in Genesis, and now we're turning to chapter 40. You can go ahead and go there because these concepts from ancient Egypt will really play into the passage that we're about to look at today. But I want to remind us of where we are in this redemption story. You remember that in the Garden of Eden, God had made man and woman good and upright, and then they took the fruit of the knowledge of the good and evil against God's command. They consumed it. And from that point forward, the curse came upon the world, came upon humanity. And the curse just kept getting worse. The curse between the husband and the wife, in a sense, where they've got this quarrel. Then the brothers quarrel, and brother kills brother with Cain and Abel. Then the whole world is plunged into a flood and scattered across the face of the earth after the flood at the Tower of Babel. But in Genesis chapter 12, God promised Abraham, as we've discussed previously, I will bless all of the world through you, through your seed, through your descendant. I'm going to reverse this curse. I'm going to turn it around and cause a blessing now to come upon humanity through you, through your seed. But as we read Genesis, it sure doesn't look like a blessing. We have Isaac and Ishmael, and they can't get along, and Ishmael has to go into the desert and is separated from Isaac. We have Jacob and Esau, and Jacob cheats Esau out of the birthright and out of the blessing, and they're separated from one another. And then we have the 11 sons of Jacob selling their good brother into slavery in Egypt. This doesn't look like a blessing at all. How is God going to really bless the world through the seed of Abraham? How is he going to reverse the curse? Let's pick up with our story in Genesis chapter 40. And let's actually rewind a little bit. Let's look at the last few verses of chapter 39. Let's start in verse 20 of 39. Joseph's master, that's Potiphar, you'll remember, took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, Yahweh was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because Yahweh was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. The name of my message today is The Language of God. The language of God. God speaks to us. He speaks to humanity. But how does he speak? What is the language of God? Number one, God speaks to us through providence. God speaks to us through providence. Here, Joseph has been upright. He has refused to sin against God. Remember, he said to Potiphar's wife, "How could I do this wicked thing and sin against God?" And where has it landed him? In prison, in the round house. And yet there in prison, God is continuing to exalt Joseph. He's continuing to cause him to become the head of a new house, the head of the round house. And he's bringing into Joseph's life a person that will be incredibly influential later in his life. Joseph just doesn't quite know it yet. How does God speak? He speaks through providence. Sometime later, now we're in chapter 40, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. This is the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And the idea is like it's like the butler and the baker. These are the highest positions in the kingdom. Maybe they're under Potiphar. Maybe they're under the chief of the guard or the head butcher, as Potiphar seems to be called. They are put in prison on Potiphar's property. But these are at least two of the highest ranking officials in all of Egypt. See, in ancient times, if you're the Pharaoh and somebody wants to kill you, how do you think they're going to do it? There's a good chance they're going to try to poison your food or poison your drink. And so you want to surround yourself with people you trust very highly, your head baker and your head cupbearer, to make sure they're the ones that are going to test it and taste it. And they're going to make sure that nothing gets into your food that's going to poison you to death. And as a result, they ended up having a lot of influence in the kingdom. They would have been very wealthy, high officials, something like cabinet secretaries today, perhaps, maybe even more powerful. And they're brought into prison. It says they offended their master, the king of Egypt. Literally in the Hebrew, they sinned against Pharaoh. They sinned against their master. Joseph, in chapter 39, is the man who will not sin against God. Well, the cupbearer and the baker sin against the Pharaoh. We don't know what they did, but we know they sinned against him. And Pharaoh was furious. He was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. Providence. And the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph. Another providence. And Joseph is the one who served them, attended to them. God speaks to us through providence. Number 2, God speaks to us through dreams. God speaks to us through dreams. And this is something that I think in our postmodern world we've forgotten about. But the ancients believed, they knew that dreams, well, that's the language of God. There's a fantastic passage in Job chapter 33, verse 13. Why do you complain to God that he answers none of man's words? Why do you say, you know what, I'm trying to talk to God, but God never talks to me. He never speaks to me. Why am I always praying and getting nothing in return? For God does speak. Shouldn't say that. God does speak, now one way, now another, though man may not perceive it. God is speaking all the time. It's just we're hard of hearing. In a dream, in a vision of the night. How does God speak? In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on men as they slumber in their beds. He may speak in their ears and terrify them with warnings, to turn man from wrongdoing and keep him from pride, to preserve his soul from the pit, his life from perishing by the sword. Numbers chapter 12. In Numbers chapter 12, we've got a scene where the children of Israel are in the desert. And you remember their three major leaders were Moses and Moses' brother Aaron and Moses' sister Miriam. And Miriam and Aaron start to complain. They start to say, you know what? Why is it you're always the one that is in charge? Doesn't God speak to us too? Aren't we also prophets? And then God comes down. He's incredibly furious with them. And he says, listen, when I speak to prophets, I do it normally through visions and dreams and dark sayings, hard to be understood. But with Moses, no. Moses sees my form. I speak to him face to face the way a man speaks with his friend. God speaks through dreams. Let's look at what happens here in these dreams. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had an interpretation of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, why are your faces sad today? Why are they literally evil today? We both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. They knew that their Ba had been active that night before, that something had happened in the spirit world, and there was some kind of a communication to them from the gods, they would have thought. But they didn't know how to interpret the language. Interpreting dreams was something that was very important to Egyptians. In fact, they used to have these schools called the houses of life, where you would go and you would learn the science of dream interpretation. And they would actually keep records of what different symbols meant in different dreams, so that you could learn over time, okay, well, this is basically what the dream language means. But they didn't have access to that kind of an interpreter in prison, and they're disturbed, and they know that something's being said to them, but they don't know what. We need an interpreter. Number 2, God speaks to us through dreams. Number 3, God speaks to us through his messenger. God speaks to us through his messenger. Let's pick up in verse 8. We both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me the dreams. Now, Joseph was not a professional dream interpreter. And yet now Joseph brings his own theology to their theology. And he says, you know who really owns interpretations? You know whose language this really is? It's God. And Joseph functions in a prophetic role. And he says, you tell it to me. He knew that being a man of God, he could ask God to give him the interpretation. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, in my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes in my hand, and I squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. This dream is crazy on the 3s. There's 3 branches there in front of the cupbearer. The branches, they bud, they blossom, and they ripen into grapes. Bud, blossom, and ripen. He takes it, he squeezes it, and he puts it in Pharaoh's hand. Take, squeeze, put in Pharaoh's hand. This dream keeps reiterating the idea of 3. This is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. He will lift up your head. Imagine that you are waiting your day in court, and you finally come before the judge, or you finally come before the Pharaoh, and your head is down, and now it's time for him to hear your case and fully consider your case, and he lifts up your head as he examines you and considers your case in the day in court. He will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. The dungeon, it's the same word for the pit, the cistern that Joseph was thrown into by his brothers. Joseph is now twice put into a dungeon. First, it's the pit in the area up north in Israel. Second, it's this dungeon in Egypt. But Joseph says, I'm innocent. In fact, capital crimes were committed against me. I was kidnapped. I was stolen. As we'll learn later in the Torah, that's something that's a capital offense. But I've done nothing wrong. I haven't even done anything wrong here in Egypt to deserve being put here. Joseph is the innocent, wise man in this passage. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread, and in the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. We know from ancient Egyptian records that they had something like 32 different kinds of bread, or maybe it was 37 different kinds of bread, somewhere around 52 different kinds of cake. And I may be getting that backwards. It may be 52 breads and 32 kinds of cake. And the numbers aren't exact, but a lot of different kinds of breads and cakes. And this baker was the person that's in charge of making sure Pharaoh gets served. And he sees in his dream that he's got 3 baskets on his head. And there's something white in the top basket. It's hard to interpret the word, but it seems to have the idea of white flour or white bread. And I told you before, you go to the houses of life to learn how to interpret dreams. Well, one of the codes in the dreams was white bread. If you're given white bread, it's a good sign. It means that you're going to be radiant. Your face is going to light up. Something good is going to happen to you. So at first, this seems good, right? Maybe this white bread portends something good. But also, according to the ancient Egyptian custom, birds taking something away from you represent dispossession. Something bad is going to happen. You're going to be stolen from in some way. So the white bread on the head, taken away from the head, well, this falls very much in line with the ancient Egyptian understanding of dreams, and Joseph interprets it. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from off you. He uses the exact same language, the exact same word. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head too from off you. It's a play upon words. Pharaoh will lift up your head from off you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh. Now, this hanging on a tree, this is the first time that this concept appears in the Bible. And it will be an incredibly important concept for Christianity. According to the Torah, cursed is everyone who hangs upon a tree. If you are hung on a tree, it is a sign of God's judgment against you. It was at the tree of knowledge of good and evil where humanity fell into the curse and fell away from God. And then afterwards, if you're put upon a tree, well, it's a sign that God's disfavor is on you. Absalom, in the story of Absalom and David, when Absalom's trying to take over David's kingdom, what happens in the battle? Absalom's long hair gets caught up into a tree. And as Gordon Hugenberger once pointed out, that was a sign, an automatic sign, Absalom hanging in a tree. God himself is against Absalom. In the book of Numbers, when Balaam would convince many people, well, through basically immoral women, to fall into immorality, what would happen to show God's disfavor on them? They would be hung on a tree. Now, the hanging upon a tree was actually not what we would imagine today. Don't imagine a gallows where there's a rope there and your neck is in it and you fall and you break your neck. That's not what was happening. It was a gruesome thing where they would take a pole and they would put it up out of the ground and they would sharpen that pole into a point. Maybe even in later times, in, for instance, Assyria or Persia, they might put razors on the top of it. And someone would be impaled. You would be impaled upon that pole. And there you are, in front of everyone, for everyone to see this accursed person that you are. But what's worse is not just that this is going to be a curse for the man in this life. Joseph says, the birds will come and they will eat away your flesh. The cupbearer and the baker would have been men of incredible wealth. They may well have been hoping to be mummified themselves one day, to have the scarab, the heart scarab, put over their own hearts so that when they appeared before Osiris and the judges, their hearts wouldn't betray them. They would have hoped that Osiris would have allowed their ba to return to their body. But here this man will not go through the process. He will not get the heart scarab. And even if he did get through all of that, there's nobody to come back to. There's no mummy for this man. In other words, Joseph says, you will die in this life, and there will be no blessing in the afterlife for you either. This is the worst possible thing that can happen to the baker. Now the third day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged, he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. God speaks to us through providence. God speaks to us through dreams. God speaks to us through his messenger. And who is God's primary messenger to us today? In the book of Hebrews, chapter 1. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. God used to speak in all kinds of ways. And I think that God still does speak through providence and through dreams and through messengers. But the primary way that he communicates to us is through Jesus himself, through his incarnate word, through the Son of God. When we look at Jesus, if we want to know the communication of the Father to us, what do? We look to Jesus. Jesus is the posture of God towards humanity. Jesus is the Word of God to you and to me. Jesus is the messenger. What's the message? What is God's message to us? Well, it's much the same as we get in this passage, as it turns out. Number one, we have all sinned and fallen short of God's glory. The passage opens by saying that the cupbearer and the baker sinned. Well, we've all sinned as well, not against the Pharaoh, but against God himself. someone much more powerful, someone much more fearsome. And number two, we must all appear before the judgment seat, not of Osiris, but of Christ in the afterlife. We too must enter into, as it were, the hall of justice to appear before Jesus. How will that fare for us? What happens at that judgment will determine our eternal fate. Number three, two fates are held out for us. The fate of the cupbearer, the fate of forgiveness, the fate of restoration, the fate of being returned to our previous position, and the fate of the baker, the fate of death, the fate of having our heart not thrown to a crocodile-headed monster, but having ourselves thrown into the lake of fire. So far you're saying, well, wait a second, that's nothing new. That's just the old Egyptian religion put in Christian language. But here's the twist. God made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, so that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. You don't get that in the story of Osiris. God has taken the innocent one, the one who did not deserve to be imprisoned, who did not deserve to die, and he has made him to be a curse for us. God has taken his own son, and Jesus is the one who has been hung upon the tree. He is the one who has taken the curse upon himself so that we might escape the judgment of the tree. Jesus is the one who has taken upon himself the wrath of God so that when our soul appears before Jesus in the day of judgment, we can proceed to bliss in the afterlife. We can be reunited with our body in the resurrection of the dead. Yes, there are many similar themes in the old Egyptian religion, but this is the new thing. This is the word of God to us, that God has provided a way that all of us can be the cupbearer and none of us can be the baker. But in this passage, it's the Pharaoh that gets to choose. In our passage, in our story, it's us. A choice is set before you now, blessing or cursing, living or dying. Choose life. Choose the way of forgiveness, of restoration, of believing that God has taken the innocent and wise son, caused him to take the place of the curse and of sin, to provide for us the opportunity for restoration in this life and in the afterlife. How will God return humanity to the garden and reverse the curse? Well, Joseph is just a foretaste. The real way that God will do this is through the great-great-great-great-grandson of Abraham that Joseph, in a sense, points forward to, who delivers us from the bond of sin and of death. Let's pray. Father, we ask that our hearts will see Christ, that we will see that we have sinned, not against Pharaoh, but against you, that we must appear before the judgment seat, not of Osiris, but of Jesus. Jesus is far wiser than any scarab amulet could ever trick. His eyes are like blazing fire that see into our souls and know our deeds. And two fates are before us, the possibility of life in the afterlife and resurrection of the body, and the possibility of the lake of fire. But we thank you that Jesus himself is the one who was hung upon the tree and took the curse, that you made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. May we all embrace life. May we all embrace Jesus today. And I pray this in Jesus' name. consuming fire.